Imagine a room where the concentration of testosterone, power, and money per square meter exceeds any permissible limit. A room where the air is so thick with cigarette smokes and unspoken tension that a single spark could trigger an explosion capable of obliterating America's sporting elite. The calendar reads June 4th, 1967. We are in Cleveland, Ohio, in the unassuming office of the Industrial Economic Union. But what is happening behind those closed blinds feels more like a scene from a crime drama than a meeting of teammates. 11 black giants sit around a long table, men whose names are carved into the granite of history. Bill Russell, the dominant center of the Boston Celtics. Jim Brown, the NFL's unstoppable machine. A young Lou Alcindor, who would later become Kareem Abdul-Jabbar. They sit with stony faces, arms crossed, their gazes fixed on the center of the room, on the only man who is standing. This is Muhammad Ali. But forget the image of the cocky showman shouting, "I am the greatest," into reporters' cameras. Here, in this confined space, stripped of flashes and fans, he looks not like a king, but like a defendant awaiting a verdict. And the judges in this tribunal are not white men in robes, but his own brothers. You likely think this meeting, known to history as the Cleveland Summit, was organized to express unconditional support for Ali, to pat him on the back and say, "We're with you, champ." That is the convenient, glossy lie history books have sold us for decades to create a beautiful myth of unity. But the truth hidden behind the closed doors of that office flips everything upside down and leaves you with the cold shiver of cynicism. These men did not gather here to save Ali. They gathered to interrogate him. They came to test his resolve, to scan his soul, and to determine if he was a sincere martyr of faith or just a confused, frightened boy being manipulated by the fanatics of the Nation of Islam. The stakes were monstrously high, and they didn't just concern Ali. Every man at that table was a millionaire, a successful athlete who had integrated into the system of white America, and supporting a traitor who refused to serve in the military could cost them everything: contracts, reputation, their comfortable lives. They looked at Ali not with love, but with the suspicion of investors afraid to sink capital into a toxic asset. In their silence read one unspoken question: are you the real deal, or are you going to drag us all to the bottom with you? But the most dangerous object in that room was not a gun or blackmail material. In the center of the table, directly in front of Ali, lay our dagger, a plain, white, typewritten sheet of paper that looked harmless but possessed the power of a nuclear warhead. It was a secret, unofficial offer from the U.S. government, delivered through intermediaries, a deal with the devil written on official letterhead. The terms were simple and agonizingly seductive. If Ali signed this document, if he agreed to a compromise, all charges of draft evasion would be dropped. He wouldn't have to go to Vietnam. He wouldn't have to crawl through the mud under Viet Cong fire. All that was required of him was to put on the uniform, salute the flag, and perform a series of exhibition boxing matches at American military bases to entertain the troops, just as Joe Louis had done during World War II. Look at that sheet. It was a ticket to freedom. It was the key that would return his world title, millions of dollars, and the love of the public. All he had to do was sell his principles, exchange his conscience for comfort. The athletes at the table knew about this offer. Moreover, many of them, pragmatic, hardened men, believed Ali should take it. They saw it as a rational exit. Cassius, don't be a fool. Sign it, and we all go home as heroes. Ali stared at that sheet, and his hands, resting on the back of a chair, turned white from the tension. He understood that this piece of paper was not salvation, but a trap, a test set for him not by the government, but by these very men sitting before him. If he reached for the paper, if he showed even a second of hesitation, they would destroy him morally. They would turn their backs on him because they would see him as a hypocrite. But if he refused, if he said no, he would condemn himself to prison, poverty, and oblivion. A visual silence hung in the room, the kind where you can hear the ticking of the watch on Bill Russell's wrist. Ali raised his eyes from the table and looked Jim Brown in the face, the organizer of the meeting, a man who knew no mercy on the field or in life. Brown's gaze was as heavy as a concrete slab. He was waiting. They were all waiting. This was the moment of truth, where the fate of not just one boxer, but the entire protest movement in sports was being decided. Ali had to make a choice: remain Cassius Clay, wealthy and obedient, or finally become Muhammad Ali, free and persecuted. He slowly removed his hands from the back of the chair, straightened to his full height, and his shadow fell over that cursed piece of paper, as if crossing out its existence. But before he could open his mouth, the air in the room became so electrified, it felt as if lightning would strike, because the interrogation was only beginning, and it promised to be more brutal than any fight in the ring. To understand the chemistry of this explosive room, you must discard illusions of brotherhood and look into the cynical reality of 1967. These 11 men, locked in 4 walls with Muhammad Ali, were not just athletes, they were corporations in human form. Jim Brown, sitting at the head of the table, was not just the greatest running back in NFL history. He was a businessman, an actor, a man who had built an empire on his image as a tough but negotiable guy. To him and the others present, Ali was not a symbol of freedom, but a walking catastrophe, a radioactive element that threatened to contaminate them all. If they walked out of there and declared support for a draft dodger, their endorsement deals would burn by morning, their television shows would be canceled, and the white America that paid their salaries would declare war on them. Therefore, the interrogation began not with hugs, but with blows that hurt more than any jab in the ring, because they struck at conscience and motives. Questions rained down on Ali like a hailstorm of stones. Do you seriously believe this nonsense about Allah and spaceships that your Elijah Muhammad talks about? Someone asked from the corner, the voice dripping not with curiosity, but with contempt. Or are you just using religion as a shield because you're afraid a Viet Cong will shoot your pretty ass in the jungle? This was the moment of truth. They weren't asking him about politics. They were asking about his courage. They suspected Ali was a coward, hiding behind a priest's robe to save his face and his money. And here, the pressure intensified. Ali, used to interrupting journalists and turning every press conference into his own show, was silent. He stood there, sweating under the crossfire of glares, feeling his usual defense, his loud voice and jokes, crumble to dust. He realized these men saw right through him. They knew the price of PR. They knew how images were manufactured, and they were looking for a crack in his armor. But the primary instrument of pressure was that white sheet of paper with the Pentagon's offer, lying on the table like a loaded gun. Jim Brown, whose authority in the room was absolute, pushed the paper toward Ali. "Look at this, Cassius," he said in his low, rumbling voice. "This is your way out. This is our way out. You don't have to die. You don't have to go to prison. Just put on the uniform. Take a few photos with generals. Do a few fights for the boys in the barracks, and you keep your title. We all keep our money. Why are you being stubborn? For what? For an old man in Chicago who's stealing your purses? Ask yourself honestly, could you hold out when your idols, the people you looked up to your whole life, are urging you to surrender for the greater good?" It was psychological pressure of incredible force. They used logic. They used common sense. They used fear. They told him, "You are one man against the system, and the system will crush you. Don't be an idiot. Be a businessman." At that moment, Ali looked not like a giant, but like a schoolboy cornered by seniors, forced to choose between honor and safety. He looked at that sheet, and the numbers written between the lines, the millions of dollars he would lose, the years of his life he would spend behind bars, danced before his eyes. The observer feels their heart tighten. because here the Santa Barbara effect kicks in, flipping everything. These great athletes, these black icons, were actually acting as agents of the establishment. They didn't want a revolution. They wanted to maintain the status quo. They pressured Ali, not because they cared about him, but because they were afraid for themselves. They saw in his lack of compromise a threat to their comfortable existence in a world of white privilege. Ali felt this fear radiating from them, the scent of expensive cologne mixed with the smell of cowardice. He realized he was alone in the room, absolutely alone. Despite being surrounded by men of the same skin color, a chasm lay between him and them. They were part of the system he had rejected, and that piece of paper on the table was a bridge back into the system, a bridge they were inviting him to cross on his knees. Ali wiped the sweat from his forehead, his gaze sliding over the faces of Bill Russell, Kareem, Brown, and he saw expectation. They expected him to break. They expected him to say, "All right, guys, you're right. To hell with principles. Where's the pen?" But instead, a cold, fanatical fire began to ignite in his eyes, the kind they mistook for madness, but which was actually the only light of truth in that dark negotiation room. At the moment when the tension in the room reached critical mass, and it seemed the walls would crack under the pressure of collective expectation, Muhammad Ali made a move that changed not only the atmosphere of the meeting, but the course of American history. He slowly pushed back his chair, the legs screeching across the floor, a sound that, in the silence, rang out like a starting pistol. Ali stood up. He no longer looked like a cornered defendant. His shoulders squared, and his face, which a minute ago had been a mask of doubt, suddenly cleared, illuminated by an internal certainty that was terrifying in its absoluteness. He looked at the white sheet of paper before him, our dagger, the symbol of compromise and safety, and slowly, with demonstrative contempt, pushed it away with his fingertips as if it were a contaminated object. A visual silence filled the room, the kind that makes your ears ring. 11 pairs of eyes followed that gesture. Bill Russell stopped breathing. Jim Brown frowned. Everyone expected an explosion, a tantrum, a Nation of Islam sermon. But Ali spoke quietly, and his voice, stripped of its usual theatricality, pierced the soul. "I'm not playing their games," he said, looking each of them in the eye one by one. "You talk to me about money. You talk to me about a career. But what is a career if I can't look in the mirror? What is money if my brothers are dying in the mud of Vietnam for a country that doesn't even consider them human?" He began to speak, and it was not the speech of a politician, but the confession of a martyr. He quoted the Quran, not as a fanatic, but as a man who had found in faith the anchor that sports had failed to provide. He spoke of the pain of his people, of the lynchings in the South, of how his conscience would not allow him to pick up a weapon and kill people who had never called him a nigger. With every word, the atmosphere in the room shifted. The skepticism on the athletes' faces began to melt, giving way to something else: surprise, respect, shame. They had come to expose a fraud, but they found a prophet. They sought a crack in his armor, but found his convictions were harder than their own bank accounts. At that moment, a Santa Barbara twist occurred. The judges became the jury, suddenly realizing they were judging an innocent man. Bill Russell, that sphinx-like giant known for his cynicism, felt a lump in his throat. He looked at Ali and saw not a brash boy, but a man ready to sacrifice everything: his youth, his title, his freedom, for a principle. This was what they all lacked. They were successful, they were rich, but they were part of the system. They played by the white master's rules. But Ali broke the rules. He held up a mirror to them, and in that mirror they saw their own cowardice. A young Lou Alcindor, the future Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, sat motionless, absorbing every word. For him, this moment was an initiation. He saw that one could be a great athlete and still be a man of conscience. Ali didn't ask them for help. He didn't ask for money. He simply said, I am ready to die for what I believe in. Are you? That question hung in the air, heavy and uncomfortable. It demanded an answer, not in words, but in action. Ali stood before them, unarmed, stripped of his titles. But in that second, he was the most powerful man in the room because he was free from the fear of losing what money can buy. When he finished speaking and sat down, head bowed, the silence that followed contained not judgment, but the sound of breaking stereotypes. Jim Brown, the organizer of this trial, slowly nodded. He realized the plan for a government deal had failed, but instead of disappointment, he felt pride. He realized Ali had passed the test. He hadn't broken. And now they faced a choice: stand aside and save their careers, or stand beside this madman and risk everything to become part of a history larger than any sport. The office door was closed, but the world outside was already beginning to change, even though no one in that room yet knew that in 5 minutes they would walk out, not as a group of wealthy athletes, but as a united front, ready to take the blow. When the heavy, massive doors of the Industrial Economic Union finally opened, releasing clouds of cigarette smoke and the scent of heavy male sweat, the hallway was instantly filled with the blinding flashes of cameras and the roar of reporters who had been waiting for hours like vultures for carrion. Journalists from major publications, plainclothes FBI agents, and sports columnists were absolutely certain of the script that was about to play out. They expected to see a broken, submissive Cassius Clay step to the microphones and announce in a trembling voice that he had rethought his behavior, accepted the government's generous offer, and was ready to put on the uniform to save his career. In their minds, saturated with the cynicism and racial prejudice of the time, no other option existed. They assumed Jim Brown and Bill Russell, those pillars of American sport, those rational millionaires, had surely knocked some sense into the confused boy and explained that going against the system was suicide. But the second the group appeared in the doorway, a visual silence filled the corridor, because the reality the press saw hit them harder than any boxing uppercut. Ali did not emerge as a defendant or a repentant sinner. He emerged in the center of a living wall. 11 black giants, the strongest and most influential athletes in America, surrounded him in a tight circle. In their stances, in the square of their shoulders, in their stony expressions, read not condemnation, but an absolute monolithic solidarity that was terrifying in its power. This was the Santa Barbara effect, flipping the plot. Instead of handing Ali over to be torn apart by the authorities, they became his bodyguards, his army, his brothers in arms. Bill Russell, a basketball legend who usually avoided the press and was famous for his difficult temperament, stepped forward and spoke a sentence that became the death knell for the government's hopes of breaking Ali quietly. "I don't envy Muhammad Ali," he said, his voice sounding like rolling thunder. "He sacrificed everything he had, but I respect him, and we all stand with him." Do you understand what happened at that moment? This wasn't just support for a friend. It was a rebellion of the elite, the wealthiest, most successful black men in the country, men with everything to lose, contracts, endorsements, status, publicly spat in the face of the establishment, declaring that conscience mattered more to them than money. At that moment, in the empty office behind closed doors, on the polished table, our dagger remained, that white sheet of paper with the Pentagon's offer. It lay there, forgotten and useless, a symbol of the easy path that had been rejected. Ali didn't take it. He left his freedom, his millions, and his title there, but he carried out of that room something far more valuable: his soul and the respect of his peers. The observer at this moment experiences a true intellectual orgasm from realizing the scale of what is happening. Ali could have walked out of that room a wealthy but lonely coward, clutching a deal with the devil in his pocket. Instead, he walked out a pauper awaiting prison, but surrounded by the love and protection of titans who recognized him as their leader. That famous photo taken in the following minutes, Ali in the center, Brown and Russell at his sides, Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, then the very young Lou Alcindor, in the background, became an icon of the era for a reason. It was the birth of modern sports activism. For the first time in history, athletes said, "We aren't just here to entertain you. We have a voice, and we will use it, even if it costs us our careers." Ali, looking into the cameras, did not wear his usual brash showman's smile. His face was serious and calm because he knew he had just won the most important fight of his life, a fight that took place not in the ring, but in a smoke-filled room in Cleveland. He lost everything material, but gained immortality, and as he walked through the crowd of journalists, which parted before him like the sea before Moses, he knew he would never be alone again, because his sacrifice had united a nation he refused to betray. Today, when we look at that grainy black and white photograph from June 4th, 1967, we see not just a historical document, but a mirror that the modern world is terrified and ashamed to look into. That image hangs in museums and is printed in textbooks as a symbol of civil courage. But if you strip away the layer of pathos and look into the faces of those men, you see something we have irrevocably lost in the pursuit of likes and endorsement deals. Do you think the world has become better since then? That athletes have become freer, richer, and more influential? That is the convenient illusion social media feeds us, but the truth is that the Cleveland Summit was not the beginning of a new era. It was its unreachable peak, after which began a slow but certain descent into the Valley of Compromise. Remember that white sheet of paper, our plot dagger, that Ali left on the table? It was more than a rejection of a government deal. It was a rejection of safety for the sake of truth. Ali and the athletes who supported him chose uncertainty, risk, and potential poverty because their consciences weighed more than their wallets. Now, let's fast forward to our time, to the era of digital noise, where every athlete is a walking corporation draped in sponsor logos from head to toe. We see NBA and NFL stars writing angry tweets. We see them take a knee during the anthem, and it seems to us that Ali's spirit lives. But here the final, most brutal Santa Barbara effect kicks in, forcing you to rethink the very concept of protest. Modern activism is often part of a marketing strategy, a safe rebellion coordinated with PR agents. Ali lost 3.5 years of his career, the very prime of his physical power. He lost millions of dollars that were never returned. He was prepared to go to prison. Ask yourself honestly, which of today's sports icons is ready to sacrifice even one season, even one major contract, for their convictions? We live in a world where courage is measured not by actions, but by Instagram reach, and where that white sheet of compromise would be signed without a second thought if the number on it was right. The paradox is that back in 1967, black athletes had far fewer rights and far less money, but they possessed a freedom unavailable to today's multimillionaires. They could gather in one room, close the door, and decide to go against the most powerful system in the world without looking at the stock prices of their sponsors. Ali proved that an athlete's greatness is defined not by statistics or championship rings, but by whether he is ready to burn his pedestal to light the way for others. That document left on the table became the symbol of the border between a star and a legend. A star shines as long as they are paid. A legend shines even when someone tries to extinguish them. The Cleveland Summit showed us that real power is not muscle or money, but the ability of 11 men with different views and interests to unite around one outcast, because they realized if they didn't protect his right to be himself, then their own privileges were worth nothing. And now, as we stand before this monumental history, I want to ask you a question that should sound like a challenge to your faith in modern heroes. Look at LeBron James, at Stephen Curry, at the stars of global football. Imagine them in that smoke-filled room in Cleveland, facing a real threat of prison and ruin. Are they capable today of repeating the act of Jim Brown and Bill Russell? Are they capable of risking everything for one man who went against the tide? Or has the era of great principles vanished forever, giving way to an era of great contracts, where every risk is calculated by lawyers and every protest must be monetized? Whose side are you on in this generational comparison? Do you believe Ali's spirit lives and modern athletes are just waiting for their moment? Or do you believe we live in the era of the golden handcuffs, where wealth has made heroes into cowards? Write one word in the comments, capable or no. I will be waiting for your verdict, because within it lies the answer to whether sport remains a place for heroism, or if it has finally turned into a business where conscience has no place in the budget.